This week we're going to start with Chapter 7 that has to do with personal communication effectiveness. Some of this you've probably heard or are aware of from other classes you've either taken with the college or even in the workplace, but we're going to go through it because it is important in terms of how well you communicate to others as well as the types of messages that you're conveying to others. Let's go over the learning objectives. They can be found on page 173 in your book. Explain the basic communication process. Describe the nature and importance of nonverbal communication in the workplace, and there's a lot of that goes on. Know how to use social media to enhance communication effectiveness. Identify barriers to communication. Know how to build bridges to communication. Overcome many gender communication barriers. And yes, there are gender communication barriers because the genders do speak and listen differently. And the last but not least, equally as important, is enhancing your listening skills. If you turn to page 175 in the book, on page 174 there is a short assessment. Again, these are always good to find out really where you're at, so I suggest you take it. This one is on my communication effectiveness, how well you basically communicate and how effective you are. So I suggest you take it. They're always good at providing some insight on yourself. And we're going to look at how the communication process takes place. There is a very good picture in your book on page 175 of the communication process. And two-way communication basically involves 3 steps. And at any point within those steps, there is always a possibility of noise or interference, which then, of course, can create problems in actually communicating or getting the message across as indicated. The first part, and again, the step 1, and if you look at your picture, the sender, okay, basically has some ideas, some words, some body language. They're trying to send a message, which we call encoding. And if you look to the right in your book, again, it pulls out certain words and it gives you the definition of those. Encoding, the process of organizing ideas into a series of symbols, which could be words, could be gestures, in order to communicate with a receiver. Okay, so this is the person that wants to say something or communicate something, and you notice they do include gestures or body language, because whether you know it or not, even when you're talking, you are giving off additional communication by your body language, your facial, your tone, your pitch. All of these things come into play when you're trying to send a message. So the first part of two-way communication is the sender encodes the message, comes up with what they want to say, and decides they're going to send it. The second step is that basically the sender chooses one or more channels to be able to send that message. And channels can be many things. It could just be that you're talking to the person. You could send an email. You could text. You could do more than one channel. I could have a meeting with my manager in their office and then follow up with an email regarding some of the things we talked about in the meeting and action items we may have agreed to. Therefore, we talked face to face, but I also followed up in writing to just confirm my understanding of everything we committed to in that conversation. And actually, I recommend this in the workplace. If you are having a face-to-face conversation that does include action item steps on either person's part, I would always follow up with an email recapping the conversation that took place and who's agreed to do what going forward in the future. That way you always have in writing what was said in a face-to-face conversation. So basically, the sender chooses a channel to send that message. And again, in your book, you see step 1, the sender is sending a message via step 2 through a channel to step 3, which is the other person or the receiver. And that receiver then has to decode the message that they get. And there's, you know, at any step of the way here, there's a possibility of noise and problems that could arise that could create problems to the original message coming across. And it can be as simple as how the receiver interprets the message and translates it. You need to understand where your receiver, who your receiver is, and who that person is, and explain it in such a way that when they get it, their interpretation is the interpretation that you intended. And so basically that's called decoding the message. When the person gets it, they decode it. They try to figure out what it was you really wanted to say, and they interpret it, and they translate what you said into some kind of information, along with what you may have said verbally, your tone, your pitch, your word choice, your facial expressions, your body language, your gestures. All of this comes into play as they're trying to decode the message that you had sent. Now, the problem with this very simplistic communication model, which you would think, well, how hard is it? Why do we have so many communication problems? The problem is that anywhere between when the step 1 sender starts sending the message to when the step 3 receiver starts decoding it, you can have communication breakdowns. You can have problems with the channel that you chose to send the message through wasn't maybe the best channel for that particular message. You have other barriers, environmental barriers, other things that come into play around you. It could be the wrong time. You could be saying one thing and your facial expression and your gestures are saying another thing. And all of these things come into play when the receiver tries to decode the message, as well as the receiver's own perceptions and interpretations can sometimes decode a message incorrectly. So it's not as simple a process as it looks. Here's the picture in the book, and as you can see, basically step 1, the sender decides on the message, encodes it, chooses a channel. Step 2, step 3 sends it to the receiver who decodes the message, and then feedback usually helps the sender evaluate the effectiveness of the message. One of the things that I always recommend in communication, particularly if you're not sure you interpret it, is what we used to call the repeat then reply approach. So if I'm talking to someone or someone's talking to me, let's switch it around. You're talking to me and you get done, then I respond back. So basically what you're telling me is that you need to leave here by 9:30 tomorrow for that meeting, but you need to make sure I have the proposal done by 9 so you can preview it before you leave in case changes are needed. Is that correct? So I'm kind of, paraphrasing or repeating back in my own words what I thought I heard and what I think I understood by the message that you sent me. A lot of times, just simply paraphrasing back what the person said to you can eliminate some communication problems that may have come up between when the sender sent it and when you as the receiver received it. So keep that in mind, either in the workplace or in your personal life, because although communication seems very easy, a lot of people have problems with it all the time. So barriers to communication, again in your book, or noise, are things that can happen between when the message is being encoded and decoded. Basically, it can be environmental, it can be noise, it could be, and we'll talk about these more, it can even be your brain going off in another direction so you're not paying attention or your brain is overloaded. There's a lot of different things that can go on that can actually create a barrier to that communication. Nonverbal communication, sending and receiving silent messages. Now I'm on page 176 and 177. Nonverbal communication as defined by the book basically is using the body, voice, or environment in numerous ways to help get a message across. Okay, on the slide, it basically says that nonverbal communication helps get a message across. It also helps detect mixed messages or gaps between what a person says and what he or she is doing or their actions. And that's, you know, something you need to be aware of. I had mentioned earlier, you could be saying one thing, but your stance, your tone, your pitch, your pause, your facial expression is sending a total different message to the person that's going to be decoding what you're saying. And that alone could really change the meaning of the message. So be aware of that, because a lot of times we're not aware of our stance, what our face is doing, maybe our pitch or the tone in our voice, and how that is being perceived or coming across to the person that's receiving the message. Environment and setting, as mentioned on the slide, can indicate importance of a message. Distance from a person could indicate an attitude toward a person. You need to really watch distance. There are basically 4 circles of intimacy, and depending on the situation you're in, you really want to make sure that you are the right distance from the person you're communicating with. And this is also very different when you're in different cultures, or you're dealing with a different culture versus an American-raised person. And if you look in your book on page 177, they pretty much show you that if you are anywhere from 0 to 6 inches away from the person, you're in what they would call close, intimate distance. You're still in an intimate distance stance if you're 6 to 18 inches away. But that's pretty close, and it's not usually the stance you would have in a business environment or with someone that you do not know well. Personal distance in your book, again, is anywhere from 1.5 feet to 2 feet for close, and far would be 2 feet to 4 feet. And that's considered personal distance. It would still be someone you would know, but not someone that you know really, really well. And then there's social distance, which is close up would be 4 feet to 7, far away would be 7 to 12, and public distance, which is 12 feet to 25 feet and beyond. You really need to be aware of this. Some people get really turned off when you're trying to communicate to them, and you're in maybe the intimate space and you don't know that person well enough to be there. So it's important to understand where you're at in terms of looking at your distance from a person. In other cultures, in other countries, it can be offending depending on how close you are or how far away you are. So if you're dealing with a different culture, make sure you understand the protocol in communicating and the distance that should be between you and that person when you're communicating. This is in your book. This is what I just went through, which are the 4 circles of intimacy, and it shows you the different levels. In most cases, you are probably going to use a personal distance in the workplace with people you know, maybe more to a social distance for people in the workplace you're not as familiar with, maybe your non-team members, and certainly outside the workplace in a social. And if you're really in the public eye with people you don't know well at all, you are going to be in the last circle. But again, where you stand while you're communicating also conveys a message. So be well aware of which one of these circles you're standing in when you're trying to communicate. Posture, okay? These are all silent messages you're sending. Leaning toward a person suggests you are favorably disposed. Let's say you go into your boss's office and you're slouching back in the chair, relaxing with your feet straight out, and this is like a serious conversation you have. Do you think that's probably the message you want to send? I wouldn't think so. I would think you'd want to send up straight on your chair, maybe even lean a little bit toward the desk, particularly if it's something important that you're going to be talking about. And again, this is on 178, but your posture can actually tell a lot of things to the person that you're talking to. Things as simple as what direction your feet are facing in when you're standing and talking to somebody. If I'm talking to you and I'm standing in front of you, but I'm kind of a little bit, my feet are kind of turned to the right a little bit, I'm kind of angled, and my body language is basically saying, you came over to talk to me, but I'm in a hurry and I don't have time to listen to this, and I'm trying to get away, even though I'm standing there. So you want to be careful of what your body is doing and start really paying attention to tuning into different body language, things that you do personally. And start watching what other people do. It's very interesting to start picking up body language that others send you. Hand gestures. Many gestures communicate a positive attitude, but also we know that hand gestures could reflect anger. Someone slamming their hand on the desk, someone using an inappropriate sign language gesture with their hands when you're driving would be a negative type of thing. So again, beware of your gestures as well. And sometimes, you know, if you're not careful, your gestures are speaking louder than your words. So always be aware of what your body is doing non-verbally. Facial expression and eye contact. Boy, this is a hard one because people do it without realizing they're doing it. They nod their head, they shake their head, they either smile, they don't smile, they may frown, or, you know, kind of frown up their eyebrows and their forehead while they're talking to you. All of these things send messages. So be aware of what your face is doing, your head, your eyes. Are you looking at the person? Are you looking away? Are you looking down? Are you staring at the person, which is also not the right message you want to send? But all of these things come in place, and you could be saying something really nice and you have a frown on your face, and so even though you're telling the person you're really happy to see him, if you have this big frown, your body language is saying something totally different, and they're going to pick up on that. Voice quality. Believe it or not, it comes into play, and this becomes real important for people that work in call center type environments where the bulk of their interaction with people and certainly customers is usually over the phone. They have to be really aware of how they sound, how they pause, the types of words they use. You don't want to speak too fast, you don't want to speak too slow, you don't want to speak too loud, you don't want to come across, you know, clogged or whiny sounding. And you also have to, again, kind of tune into your caller on the other end of the phone, because sometimes maybe you have a person on the phone that doesn't hear as well, and you may have to speak a little louder than you would normally so that this person can understand what you're saying. But you convey a message. I can say the same thing in a different tone, and my meaning is going to come across very differently depending on the tone I pick and how I deliver that message. So be aware of it. Personal appearance. More respect and privileges are given to people that are perceived as being well-dressed and attractive, whether you like it or not. You know, if you're going to go and talk to somebody, and certainly if you're going to persuade somebody, or you're a salesperson and you're going to talk to a customer about, you know, a sales pitch, I wouldn't suggest going in in ripped up shorts and a tank top, you know, smoking a cigarette and, you know, with your hair all over the place. I would tend to dress a little smarter, be a little sharper, and present yourself a little better, because within that first 30 seconds, that person you met is already making and developing an opinion about who you are. Again, well dressed depends on the situation and the organizational culture. All right, so it all depends on who you're going to talk to, what culture you are speaking in, because that changes dramatically. And I'll give you an example. This is just kind of a brief one, but when we network and we meet people at networking functions as business people, we think nothing of pulling out our business card after we're talking to the person and say, hey, here's my business card, and you know, keep me in mind if something ever comes up, give me a call. Just like that, very casual. We take it, we put it in our pocket. If you were to do that in Japan, you would highly insult the person that you're talking to. First of all, direct contact, eye contact in Japan is not what you want to do. When you first meet someone, it's kind of like you see in TV. You know, you do the nod down with your head to meet them, and when they give you their business card, you have to take that business card with 2 hands, and you hold it on either side, you pull it in, you look at it, you're treating it very respectfully, just as though it were the person that you were taking and then going to, you know, put in with your other contacts. You don't just say, yeah, here, and stick it in your pocket. It's very insulting. You take it with both hands, you look at it, you read it, and then you nod again to the person that's giving you that particular card. If not, you have offended the person. If you stare them right in the eyes when you first meet them, you have offended the person. Now, this is over in Japan. This may not necessarily be a Japanese person that is working here in the States and has become more Americanized or socialized, but there are some very different cultural things depending on the country and the culture that you may be interacting with, so be aware of that. If you're trying to communicate and you're having problems, you know, is it a cultural thing that's causing your problems? In which case you might need to take a different tact to try to get your points across. Touching another person, and this is going to fall into page 180. It's a powerful vehicle for conveying emotions. Certainly if it's somebody that you know and they're having a hard time, and you know, you show that empathy and you put the hand on their shoulder. You have to be careful about it in the workplace because it can be misinterpreted. As you can see by C, we don't just, you know, constantly pat somebody on the back or on the shoulder, or because it could be misinterpreted, and someone could interpret that as sexual harassment or sexism. So you really need to limit your touching in the office, even if it may be your culture. While here in America, you know, we shake hands, but we're not, you know, necessarily touchy-feely all the time. Hugging is controversial. Fist bump or handshake is often preferred, even if it's someone you know well. But again, it's knowing your audience and knowing where you're at. I have several folks here that I am very close with on faculty that actually come from a Hispanic background, and they do hug. And so every morning when I see these folks, we give each other a hug and a kiss on either cheek, because that is socially acceptable in the culture that they come from, and it doesn't bother me. And so that's how we greet each other. But I wouldn't just do that to anybody. Again, when I was working in Mexico and implementing switches down there, when we would first meet someone, when you would go into a meeting and you meet someone, yes, you would stick out your hand and you would do a handshake, but again, you would kiss the person on both sides of the cheek as you're introducing yourself. That is how they did it, men or women. Okay, if you walked into a business meeting here and you did that, people would probably pull back and look at you like you're nuts. So again, it's knowing the culture and what the basically, you know, the rules and regulations are in that particular culture of what is socially acceptable in verbal and nonverbal communication. Be governed by cultural attitudes and status, you know, such as a higher ranking person initiating touching. I don't know that I've ever really had that experience, but I have had the experience where when you deal with a different culture, there are different ways to express, and there are things that would seem unusual to us here, but that if you didn't do there would be insulting to the culture or the customer that you're dealing with in that culture. Lie detection through nonverbal communication, and this starts on 180. Well, actually, it starts and finishes on 180. No behavior or behavior pattern in all people, in all situations, indicates deception. Okay? So, I mean, because someone doesn't look at you or rolls their eyes, doesn't necessarily mean they're lying. However, in other cases, certain behavior can indicate, you know, that, or detect that a lie was told. If you look in your book, they talk about a team of 3 researchers who reviewed the evidence of liars about human behavior and deception detection, concluded that no researcher has documented what they call the Pinocchio response. Remember the fairy tale, every time Pinocchio told a lie, his nose grew longer. And so they have not really been able to find a pattern that says absolutely when a person does this. There's some things they know, but they can't totally pinpoint it at 100% positivity. Okay, so keep that in mind. Lying does require extra effort, and that might show up in longer pauses between thoughts as the person's trying to really contemplate the lie. Fewer hand or head movements. Liars appear to be more nervous than truth tellers, sometimes speak high pitch, sometimes fidget. And you know, some of you may see this in your kids. When they're not telling you the truth, you know them well enough, you start to pick up on the signs. So it's important to kind of watch those things, but don't under any circumstance assume that just because someone might fidget that they're lying. They could be extremely nervous about talking to you about whatever it is they're talking about. So, you know, learn to read the body language, but don't base all your assumptions on just everything you see. Learn to read the body language, listen to what's being said, and try to make the best interpretation. Using social media to enhance communication effectiveness, on page 181 in your book. Social media sites provide the serious workers with opportunities to display positive communication skills. Positive, you notice. Let's underline that, okay? You can demonstrate your loyalty by posting gracious comments about your employer. You can demonstrate professional level communication skills, okay, if needed, and your book does cover these, and they talk about this in particular in the use of like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Some offices actually have their own little, what we call here, the person IMs you, so you can immediately talk to them internally here versus sending an email. I can just IM the person, you know, 2 buildings away. They can immediately see it and immediately respond if I want to talk to them that way. Some companies have what they call their own intranet, okay, which is just company-based for company things and company discussions and things that go on inside the company. So there can be positive things that happen through social networking, as well as, you all know, there can be negative things that happen through social networking. So be very careful how you use social networking. And we'll talk about that going forward here in the slides, because I believe it comes up. Again, positive things, you can establish meaningful contact with workers far and wide. If you're a huge company and maybe have a corporate location in tons of international sites, you can, within the company, network or talk to, you know, someone that's over in Germany, and maybe even develop those relationships within the company if, say, you're here in Texas. So there are positive things that come out through social networking. You can display a desire to help others grow and develop by sending useful information. We used to share that when we ran into issues that came up in installation of switches or something that went wrong in the project management portion of bringing in a switch. We would send that on to the next location or the next group that we would know was going to be doing the same type of an installation, to let them know what we ran into and what we did to resolve it, or what they should do to begin with, so they don't run into the same problems that we had when we were installing. For professionally oriented websites, ask first before inviting another person to become a connection. For example, and they give you LinkedIn, you want to ask, you know, the person, may I send you a LinkedIn invitation? And LinkedIn, by the way, is considered a professional-oriented website geared toward professionals putting information out there and networking with each other. It is not like a Twitter or a Facebook, and shouldn't really be used in that manner. Can negative things happen with social network? Well, of course, we all know that. All of the positive approaches mentioned above could be reversed and could become negative depending on how they're used, okay? Using social networking sites eliminates face-to-face interaction with work associates, so there is room for misinterpretation, okay? Again, whenever you're posting something and writing it, you can't see a person's face, you can't see the body language. There's always room for that channel to have some kind of noise on it and your message to be misinterpreted. Obviously, posting confidential or derogatory information about your employer, which shows low emotional intelligence, is a swift way to get fired. I know people that have done things like go out of town on company business. Okay, so the company is paying for you to be out of town to do whatever it is you're doing, attending a seminar, you know, implementing a telephone switch, whatever the case may be. And although you're off work, it's after hours, you go out to the bar and get yourself rip-roaring drunk, and you're dancing on the tables and acting the fool, and the people you're with are taking these pictures and posting them on Facebook. Remember, when you're on company payroll, even if you are out of town doing something for the company and it's after hours, you still represent the company. All right? So you don't want your manager going out there to look and see that, you know, you're, I don't know, dancing crazy on the tables at some bar when you were set there to professionally represent the company. So be very careful about what you post on these sites, because, you know, you can lose jobs, and I've known people that have lost jobs. Same thing as someone sending a joke internally through internal email in the company. You know, be very careful, because people then forward this on, and the next thing you know, it gets forwarded to 20 people, and if it's what's called a more or less inappropriate joke, you could lose your job. And I've also known people that have gotten fired because of the jokes they were sending through company email, which, remember, is the company's asset. That's their computer, that's their email. Okay, so always be very careful when you're in the work environment how you are presenting yourself. Posting derogatory information and photos about a coworker can form backstabbing. But even if it's not about a coworker, if you're just posting things, let's say you call in sick to the office, and then you go out and you post all this stuff on Facebook that shows your, you know, long weekend in Corpus Christi at the beach, and your boss happens to go out and look. Okay, I know a lot of employers now, when they interview people, they go out to see if there's a Facebook site. before they even, sometimes before they even bring them in for an interview, but sometimes before they make a hiring decision. So you want to be very careful about what you have out there. You want to be careful about who you friend, and don't friend people you don't know. You know, it all goes back to that whole ethical question about whether or not, you know, you should ask somebody before you post something of them, because once it's out there, everybody and their brother in many cases can see it. Engaging in social networking is inappropriate at times, okay? If you're accessing a social network site for non-business purposes at work, like you're out there playing Farmville or on one of the games, you know, that's not what you should be doing at work time. You're being paid to be doing your work. And again, you're using the company assets to be out in the internet playing a game. Probably not the best use of your time. And don't for 1 minute think that IT groups and large companies cannot go back and look at everything and anything you've been doing on your computer, even things you delete, because they can. Things can be pulled up. Sites that you looked at can be pulled up. I know people that have been fired because they've gone back and done an IT trail on what these people were doing and what sites they were logging into on company time. So again, just be smart, okay? I mean, you know what you need to be doing at work. Just do what you need to be doing at work, and you know, make sure if you want to do something a little bit crazy, you do it on your own computer, on your own time. So let's talk about frequent barriers to communication, and that starts on page 184. Sending a self-centered message, better to state what you can do for another person, is basically a barrier to communication. And they give you an example in the book. This one's very self-centered. You've got to buy a few food supplements from me. I can't meet my credit card payments. Okay? Very self-centered. This person obviously is, you know, selling some kind of food supplements. They're trying to make you feel guilty so that you will buy these food supplements from them, but it's really all about them. Okay? That can really be a barrier to communication, and it can tick you off, and you may never buy anything from them going forward. A less self-centered might be, would you be interested in purchasing a few food supplements that would bring you more energy, help you live longer? If your answer is yes, then I can help you. Okay, it's not about me. It's about telling you more about what I have. One-way communication. Obviously, communication is a two-way street. It's not effective communication unless it goes back and forth. Unless you're just, you know, sending out a list of something and you're not expecting any response back. But in most cases, even if you're sending out processes and procedures written, you need to allow people two-way communication in case they don't understand the process or procedure that you have sent out, so that they can ask questions. So, but these are all different things. These are all things that could cause a misinterpretation of the message, or someone to not even understand the message that's being sent. Different interpretations of words are semantics, which is basically the study of words and their meanings and symbols. So again, I ask you to keep in mind when you're dealing with different cultures, because you may run into semantics. Things could mean something totally different. The same word could mean something totally different in a different culture than it does here. So just keep that in mind when you're using different words, the semantics of them. Credibility of the sender and mixed messages, and that's on page 186. Type of message in which the sender might recommend one thing to others yet behave in another way. You're sending a mixed message. Okay, and some of that is basically the trustworthiness of the sender, but you're saying one thing and you're doing another. It could be, you've heard some people say, you know, you're not walking the talk. All right, I tell you one thing, but I do the complete opposite. How credible is my message? I'm sending a very mixed signal, And chances are you're going to notice that. And if I'm really trying to convince you of something or get my point across, I'm probably not doing it because my behavior is totally different than what I'm telling you needs to happen. Distortion and filtering of information. This is a big one. People often hear what they want to hear. They're listening, but they're picking and choosing certain words, and those are the words that are standing out in their head. Or, this is a big thing that people do when they're talking. You start talking to me and I'm already finishing your sentence in my head and already thinking of my reply. The minute I start thinking of how I'm going to reply while you're still talking, I'm not actively listening anymore. Okay, so if I catch myself doing that, I need to stop. And I need to really listen to your message before I think of my reply, because once I stop listening, my reply may not be the reply that's needed because I didn't bother to listen to the rest of the message. So, you know, people often hear what they want to hear. There's fear sometimes, or a negative reaction when delivering bad news. If someone thinks they're getting bad news or someone has to give bad news, this could also create a barrier as to how you're delivering or how you're receiving that. Different perspectives and experiences may lead to a different perception of words and concepts. You're dealing with a different person. They've had different life experiences. They're going to draw from their experiences and their perceptions when they basically decode the message you're sending, as you would do if someone's talking to you. So, you know, that's where that repeat then reply comes in very handy, so that you make sure that your perception of what they said is correct. Emotions and attitudes, strong feelings can interfere with sending or receiving messages. Okay, if it's something you feel very strongly about, let's say I feel very strongly about animal welfare and animal care, and I go to a meeting and I'm listening to a speech that is a persuasive speech on a business topic, but one of the examples that the person that is doing the speech gives is to back up something he's saying in the business presentation, is his personal hunting experience. I have a strong feeling about that. It's my feeling, I understand that, but it's probably right then and there, if I'm not careful, going to shut down my listening to anything else that person has to say. Okay? So be careful of that, because that's not always a good thing. You're entitled to believe the way you believe, but understand that when you shut something down because of that, or because you're emotionally distraught at the moment, you really might be missing the message, and it might be an important message that you're missing. Communication overload. This is a major barrier today. We all have it, you know, and it's the kind of thing that you got so much running through your mind. You could talk to the person and you walk away and you're like, wait a minute, what did she just say? Was that Wednesday or Tuesday? And you could swear you were listening. Okay? Another example I like to give is, how many of you had, you know, driven home from work one night, and the next thing you know, you're in your driveway, and really, you don't remember the drive. Okay? I mean, it's kind of like Pavlov's dog. You took the same road, but you're like, oh, wow, I'm home already. You don't remember automatically turning down the different roads, because that whole time you were driving home, you're running through the 80 million things that are going through your head. Not necessarily a good thing when you're driving, because you should be really concentrating on driving. If you're that strongly in depth and all the thoughts going through your head, you know, you're not really concentrating on what you're doing at hand. It's kind of automatic, and the next thing you know, you're home. But what if somebody ran out in front of you? What if a small kid I mean, there's so many things can happen, but I can tell you it's happened to me. I've been, you know, going through so many things in my head. Next thing you know, I pull in the drive and I'm like, wow, that was fast. I don't even remember getting here. Okay, so be real careful. When you're talking to somebody, sometimes the same stuff's going on. You're talking to me and I'm thinking about, I really need to plan that test for my other class, and I need to grade those papers for my third class, and I need to, and that's running through my head. I'm not verbally saying it, but that's all that communication overload. So the more you become aware of these things, the better off you will be at listening and actually hearing what someone is telling you. And it's not easy. It's hard, and it takes a concentrated effort. Improper timing, okay? You must know how and when to deliver the message, all right? If someone has just, lost a loved one, and you're at the funeral, and you're telling them how sorry you are that they lost this person, your next step is not going to be, say, when are we going to get together to talk about that proposal, by the way? I really need to get it in, and I really want your input before I turn it over and have them start looking at it. That is the wrong time. That is the wrong place, okay? So be aware of that. When you're delivering a message, if you want your message to get through, make sure you kind of test the waters to see what's going on with the person that you're delivering the message to. Poor communication skills include garbled communication, low conviction of the sender, garbled communication, things we can't really understand. All right, it's so garbled, or basically they're just jumping all around that you can't understand it. Or let's say they left it in a voicemail message, and you have to play it back 16 times because you can't even hear what the person's name is and the phone number. All right, so be aware of that. Depending on what channel you're communicating through, make sure that you can clearly be heard and understood. Same thing if you're writing an email, okay? You're not going to, type it in all caps. You're not going to type it in red. Even though you just happen to be a creative, colorful person, you're sending a message, and that may come across to the other person as you yelling in an email message. Okay? And always read your email before you send it. Run your spell checks on it. If you're mad, you certainly don't want to respond to an email when you are furious. You want to take a walk around the block, cool off, and then come back and look at how you're going to respond to the message that may have really set you off and, blown up your whole thoughts for the day. Don't respond while you are emotionally upset, because you end up saying something you don't want to say, and it might be said to the wrong person. Cultural and language barriers, I think I've hit on this enough. You need to be aware of it. Cultural values might influence the interpretation of a message. Language barriers may occur simply because the person does not understand the other person's accent. They may not totally understand the language. So you have to be aware of cultural barriers when you are delivering the message. And or making sure when the person that's receiving it and decoding it is actually understanding the message correctly. Building bridges to communication. Okay, so it's important to basically be aware of the roadblocks and the barriers, and that they do exist, and try some techniques to maybe help better communicate and build bridges so that you can communicate better. The book covers 10 different things. Appeal to human needs and time your messages. Try to satisfy an unsatisfied need. Okay? The biggest thing is time your messages. Don't be sending a message at the wrong time, the wrong place. Repeat your messages assertively using more than one channel if it looks like a person isn't understanding, or if you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And they give you the example I believe I gave you, an in-person conversation followed up by an email or a text. Okay, it can even be more effective because you're two ways, you're covering the conversation. Have a positive attitude and be persuasive. Always being positive enhances any type of persuasiveness if you're trying to go in and talk about wanting to do something or run a project by a boss. Okay? Discuss differences in frames of reference. This would be dealing with different viewpoints and perspectives. So if someone's coming from it in terms of a different viewpoint, understand their viewpoint and perspective, but then you want to make sure that they understand where your frame is at and where you're coming from. Always check for comprehensions and feelings through any feedback. Okay, don't be a hit and run communicator. I kind of like that. Okay, here's my message, boom, and you're off. Okay, and you're not really sure whether they understood it or not. You don't care, you're on to the next person. Make sure that when you're delivering a message, particularly if it's important, that the understanding that you want and the decoding that you want to happen takes place and is correct. It's just as much your responsibility as the sender as it is the receiver. Minimize defensive communication. People want to protect their self-esteem while sending and receiving messages. A lot of that sometimes goes back to just watch how you're wording something. Okay? You may not have meant to put somebody on the defense, but the word choice and the tone you used did just that. So be aware when you are talking of what your tone is saying, what your word choice is saying, and how that message is coming through. Obviously, you know, if you're trying to deliver a message and you want it to be understood, you don't want the receiver to become defensive, because once that happens, then they're not listening to your message anymore. Combat communication overload. Be selective in processing information, but be thorough. That's a hard one, because we always have 500 million things running through our brain. It's really, when you're in a conversation and you start to realize, it's training yourself to realize that you're floating somewhere else and thinking about something else, and going stop and focus back in on who you're talking to and what you're talking about. Use mirroring to establish rapport. Effective to imitate the breathing pattern of another person. I've never done this, but I have heard that it works. Okay, you kind of mirror where the person's at. You kind of start using the same breathing pattern. Not something that they notice, okay, but you just kind of get in sync with that other person that you're talking to. Sometimes, you know, building bridges to communication with people that maybe you have a hard time communicating with entails just engaging in some small talk or some positive gossip about what's going on at work, not negative. Okay? Small talk contributes to your conversational skills. You collect tidbits of information that you then can share. Positive gossip brings power and credibility. If you can tell some people positive things that are going on with the company. Did you guys know we're going to be rolling out this new program, blah, 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 okay? Solicit feedback on your communication effectiveness. Always do it. It's hard. We don't want to hear that we're not communicating effectively. So get up the courage, but you might pick up some good suggestions. If you notice you're having problems with particular people at work, and you have some folks that you're pretty good friends with, or they're pretty good peers, ask them to listen to your conversation sometime and maybe point out some pointers, or if they can make some suggestions as to why you're having such a hard time communicating with a particular individual. What is it you're not picking up on? Ask your supervisor, your manager, peers, husband, wife, children. People can always give you some feedback as to what they see you do well or you don't do well in your communication effectiveness. Use that feedback positively. A few principles for persuasive communication, and that basically checks through, let me see, what point are we at? We're going over to page 191, 2, 3. Know exactly what you want when you're actually in some kind of a persuasive conversation. If you're going to talk to somebody about something, know what it is you're asking for, okay? If you're trying to persuade someone to, you know, purchase something or to allow you to do something in the company that maybe has not been done before. You really have to have a reputation as a trustworthy source of information, or it's going to make it harder to persuade them. If you're a salesperson and you're trying to persuade somebody to buy something, you might want to use powerful words that help you bond with the customer. So the more you know about the customer and their company before you go out to talk to them, the better off it will be when you get in front of them. When you speak, basically begin with your headline, or begin with the most important part that you want to make and why you're coming in to talk to the person. Minimize wimp phrases. I love that. I may be wrong. You don't want to say that. You're trying to persuade somebody. I might be wrong, but I really think this might be the good way to go. That's a wimpy phrase. Okay? You want to just say, I really think this is the way to go. Let me tell you why. Speak with big picture perspective instead of presenting small details. Paint the big picture. Make them see what you want them to see, so that this one thing you're asking for is something that can be given, done, or the money, or you want them to buy your product, whatever the case may be. This is a big one, okay? Overcoming gender barriers to communication. Probably some of you didn't think there were gender barriers. There are. There's gender barriers to communication, both in speaking and in listening, okay? Men and women speak differently and they listen differently. It's not good, bad, and different. It just is. So be aware of that when you are trying to communicate to a different gender. Now, on top of that, okay, that is the norm. We as women listen differently, and we communicate differently, and men listen and communicate differently than us. But then on top of that, sometimes people have gender stereotypes, which creates an even bigger barrier to the communication process. So you really need to be aware of that. I am on page 193, and it starts to go through some of these. Women prefer to use conversation for rapport building and social connections. And that's normally how they'll even start a conversation when they come in to talk to you, even if it's about something important. They're going to, they build the rapport first, okay? Men prefer to talk primarily as a means to preserve independence and status by displaying knowledge and skill. Men want to get to the point, okay? If they come in and it's a business situation, they're going to be pretty straightforward, pretty direct, and get to the point of whatever it is they want to talk about. Women will get to the point. It's not normally how they first start out. Why is this important? It becomes real important if you're a leader. Okay? If you're a manager or you're a supervisor and you have men and women on your team and you have to have conversations with them, realize how you want to frame your conversation, because it's going to be different when you're talking to one of the men in your group than it is to one of the women, even if you are giving the same information. If you're talking to them separately, frame it differently so that they can pick up on it, connect to it, and remember it. Women, when they talk, usually are, want someone to be empathetic to what they're saying. They're not necessarily looking for a solution. This becomes one of the biggest issues in relationships sometimes, because women want to talk because they just want to talk through things, and they want someone to listen and say, I understand, yep. I mean, not fake, but really meaning that. They're not necessarily looking for you to solve their problem. Sometimes in a relationship, when women do this, men feel uptight because they think, well, you're telling me this because you want me to solve your problem, and I don't have an answer for you, and it makes them uncomfortable. In most cases, that's not the point. They just want you to listen. Okay, guys? You don't always have to have the solutions. Men prefer to work out their problems by themselves, where sometimes women will go, so, what? Tell me what's going on. I can tell there's a problem. Tell me about it. What's going on with you? And they, no, there's nothing wrong. I don't want to talk about it. Okay? It's just a different way in how the different sexes approach things. Okay, women like to talk about it, and even talk about solutions with another person, and sometimes even talking about the problem, they come up with their solution. A lot of times men want to kind of mull it over, think it over in their head, figure out what they're going to do, and work through the problems by themselves. They're not, as sherry as we are in terms of wanting to get feedback from other people. Men tend to be more direct and less apologetic in their conversation. It doesn't mean they're horrible people. That's just their approach. Okay, whereas women are more polite and sometimes apologetic. In business, I suggest even as women that if you are a person that is always apologetic or saying, I'm sorry, particularly if you start to get in a role where you're leading people, that you kind of reframe that. Now, there's times that you might want to apologize to a peer or team member. If you were having a bad day and snapped somebody's head off without thinking about it, then definitely you owe that person an apology. But you shouldn't tentatively use your conversation when you're in a leadership role. It shouldn't be that, well, I think this might be. State your direction and let your team know where you need them to go. Okay? You need to come across that way when you're leading people. Women tend to be more conciliatory when facing differences, where men can become more intimidating. Now this is, again, do I know women that can be very intimidating? Yes. Do I know men and women that are different? Yes. This is researchers doing this, and this is, on average, this is what happens. You can always find a person one way or the other that doesn't fall into this exact description of gender barriers. But it is good to be aware of it, so that when you are dealing with different genders, you're aware of how they react, how they listen, how they speak, and you can tailor your approach to better communicate with that particular gender. Men are more interested than women in calling attention to their accomplishments or hogging recognition. That is true. In many cases, women don't call enough attention to their accomplishments in the workplace, or as they say, hog that recognition. It is something that we probably could do better in the workplace, is bring attention to our accomplishments. Not in an egotistical way, but when you're writing up your performance appraisal and you're doing the things that you've done, doggone it, put the things that you have accomplished and the projects you have completed. Let your manager know what you've done. Sometimes, depending on who's doing your appraisal, they're not working with you on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes you do have to sing your own praises. Women are more likely to use a gentle expletive, whereas men tend to be a little harsher. In the workplace, you need to be very careful about using any kind of language that would not be acceptable, even in joking or even in talking to somebody that you know doesn't have a problem with it. If someone overhears that and feels offended, they can go to HR, and you could have HR talking to you regarding the language that you're using in the workplace. So you need to really be careful about what you say, where, when, and how to who, and remember that if it's overheard, it can be just as disruptive, and someone could take it to an HR level or a manager level. Women tend to use the word I, me, mine more frequently. And these are 9 of the differences that, based on studies that they've come up with. Again, they're in your book on page 193 and 194. Women tend to basically approach things more from an emotional point of view. That doesn't mean they're emotional, but they actually, if someone's talking, they'll read the feelings first and then listen to the words. The men will actually look at the feelings last, and they'll be listening more to the point that you're trying to get to. And in one study that I read about, in fact, I might have put this video in here, I'm not sure. Women are more perceptive in some ways of picking up the emotional behind the statement, as well as picking up body language a little easier. Sometimes if you are, we'll give this example, if you are sitting in a bar, a man and a woman, and the woman looks at you and kind of smiles because she likes you and maybe she's wanting to talk to you, the guy will miss it. She actually has to do that same thing 3 times before a guy will actually pick up on the fact that maybe she wants him to come over and say hello. Where a woman might pick up on it immediately that this person is making eyes at this guy and wants to talk to him. So, you know, again, I want to convey, it's not a good, bad, indifferent, it's that we're different. We think differently, we approach things a different way. Does it mean we can't communicate? Absolutely not. We can certainly communicate, and we do. It just means be aware of these things. Gender barriers are no different than being aware of cultural barriers. Okay? You just have to be aware of them when you're trying to communicate to someone effectively. A major component of effective listening is to be, oh, I think I went backwards, sorry. Ooh, that just threw you. I was just making sure you were all awake. Personal communication style, now I'm on page 198. How you combine verbal and nonverbal communication becomes your style of communication. Can you change your style of communication? Yes, you can. But first of all, you have to become aware of your style, understand your style, to then work on what you may want to change in your style of communication. It is a major component of your personality. It's how you come across, and so be aware of it when you're talking to people. Hundreds of styles are possible, and you may use different styles in different situations, and you probably should, depending on the audience and the situation that you're in. So this basically takes you through Chapter 7. Again, if you look on page 199, summary and review. They always do a really good job in this book on their summary and reviews in the chapter. You may want to actually just read through some of the case studies and answer some of the questions based on what you read in the chapter. But this is basically Chapter 7, which is really your personal communication style. In Chapter 8, we're going to look a little more in detail about formal forms of communication in the workplace and organizations, and informal types of communication in the workplace, and go from there.